Good afternoon. My name is Jennifer Bryant, and I'm the Program Manager for Community Wealth Building Initiatives at the Washington Area Community Investment Fund, also known as Wacif. Next slide, please. Wacif is one of the DC area's leading community development financial institutions focused on small business development. Wacif's mission is to increase equity and economic opportunity in underserved communities in the Washington, D.C. area by investing knowledge, social, and financial capital in low and moderate income entrepreneurs. In the last 7 years, Wacif has invested over $8 million throughout the region. Next slide, please. Wacif has 4 primary focus areas. We have a number of signature initiatives, including the JP Morgan Chase Entrepreneurs of Color Fund, the Minnesota Avenue Main Streets Program, and the DC Employee Ownership Initiative, which is the program I lead at Wacif. We host regular trainings and events, which you can find by following us on Eventbrite or signing up for our e-newsletter at www.wacif.org. Wacif offers pro bono technical assistance and loan capital up to $250,000 to businesses in the DC area. Next slide, please. Here are some of the core focus areas for the DC Employee Ownership Initiative. One program I'll highlight is our DC Co-op Impact Grant. Earlier this year, we awarded $40,000 to 7 DC area cooperatives led by people of color. The grant is for cooperatives in every stage of development, from idea to startup to growth stage. I encourage you to apply for the next round. Today's webinar is the first in our 4-part Fall Co-op Business webinar series. Our goal is to give you the tools to start, grow, and finance a cooperative business. Today's session is on entity formation, and we're excited to partner with Professor Susan Jones and the George Washington University Small Business and Community Economic Development Clinic. This series is made possible with support from the Cooperative Development Foundation. The webinar recording will be emailed to attendees and made available on the Wacif YouTube page. If you're interested in learning more about cooperatives, the DC Employee Ownership Initiative, or Wacif, please feel free to reach out to me at jbryant@wacif.org. I will also share my contact information, and again, that in the email that will go out afterwards. Just to give a brief overview of the webinar tools in Zoom, if you have a question, feel free to post them in the Q&A at the bottom, and we will answer them at the end. And with that, I would like to turn it over to Professor Susan Jones.
Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Jennifer, for this opportunity. We are really delighted to be here with you. Again, I am Professor Susan Jones. I direct the law school's Small Business and Community Economic Development Clinic. And I am pleased to be joined by a cohort of student attorneys who will be presenting today. Next slide, please. And there's the cohort of student attorneys who are this semester busy working with a number of nonprofit and for-profit small businesses, including limited liability companies, benefit corporations, and many other business entities. We're deeply grateful to Wacif for this opportunity to present. Cooperatives are important now more than ever during these turbulent times, and I'm so pleased that so many people are interested in this form of business. Next slide, please. Each semester, students enrolled in the Small Business Clinic represent select nonprofit organizations, small and micro businesses, and artists. The legal work includes helping clients and organizations choose an appropriate form of business. We draft a variety of legal documents, including entity formation documents, such as articles of organization and operating agreements for an LLC, or in the case of a corporation, we'll draft articles of incorporation and bylaws and other corporate documents. We also review and draft contracts, help businesses comply with DC's various complex business regulatory requirements, and we handle intellectual property matters such as copyright and trademark law. Next slide, please. So today, we will give an overview of the types of legal entities available to create co-ops and provide examples of co-ops and how a few are organized. But it's also important to point out what we will not do today. So we will not provide legal advice. Our community-based law practice is based in DC, so we will discuss entities in DC, and we also won't go into depth on any specific entity because that entity selection process is very fact-specific. So here's our formal disclaimer that this is a presentation that's designed to be educational in nature. And please, if you have specific legal questions, please consult a lawyer. I will now turn it over to our first student attorney presenter, Andrew.
Hello, everyone. I'm Andrew, one of the student attorneys at the clinic. And really just a very brief history and overview of cooperatives is necessary to understand why we even have to have this discussion over all these different ways you can structure your cooperative. So the International Cooperative Alliance, one of the oldest and biggest players in the cooperative space, defines a cooperative as an autonomous association of persons united voluntarily to meet their common economic, social, and cultural needs and aspiration through a jointly owned and democratically controlled enterprise. There's a lot to unpack there. But what that definition does is it tells us that co-ops aren't just a business, they're a social movement, an economic arrangement, and a legal construct. And they really run the gamut in terms of what they can do. There are worker cooperatives, producer cooperatives, art co-ops, agricultural co-ops, a lot of different types. So traditionally, co-ops were treated as corporations, which members ran and owned. But today they take many different legal forms. So in the 2000s, we started to see states allowing a different type of cooperative beyond just in the form of a corporation called the Next Generation Cooperative. And a couple of things are important to note about this. First, NGCs, not Next Generation Cooperatives, didn't have to be corporations. They could be LLCs or partnerships, which have important implications that we'll talk about a little bit later. And second, NGCs allowed non-members to invest in and have control over the cooperative. So in the traditional co-op, the only people who have control over the co-op are the ones who are actually a part of it and participating in the cooperative. But NGCs allowed non-member investors to provide some funding and have some control as a way of getting extra funding to the co-ops when they needed it. But some people felt like NGCs really allowed investors to have too much control, and that kind of undermined the social mission and community focus of cooperatives. And so in response to that, we started seeing a new type of co-op called the Limited Cooperative Association, or LCA. And the LCA really just tries to find a middle ground between those two by still allowing some outside investment and control to entice that investment, but providing additional safeguards to make sure that the social mission and community focus are in the forefront and protected. Just a few facts and figures quickly. You can see at the top left there, 64,000 US cooperatives, not even including housing co-ops. And that was in 2015. I imagine the number has only gone up since then. And another number that sticks out to me, in the bottom right there, you can see over 1 million families living in cooperative housing. And I'll tell you a little bit later about this, but the housing co-op scene in DC is very lively. But these figures just kind of help to point out how important co-ops are in our economy and society. And just a few examples of DC co-ops. We actually got these examples from a press release of recent Wacif grantees. But the types really, like I said earlier, run the gamut. You have grocery co-ops, worker co-ops, collaborative co-ops, art co-ops. There are all these different types, and the possibilities for what you can do with a co-op are really limitless.
Hi everyone, my name is Margaret, and before we get into talking about specific choices of entity, we wanted to give you a brief overview of the different entity choices and also where we're going to go. Next slide. So charts like these are pretty widely available on Google and through a lot of other organizations. This one in particular is from the DC Bar Pro Bono Center. And the reason we wanted to show this all to you is because charts like these are really helpful when you're starting to think about choice of entity for your own businesses. The different entities' names and potentially the factors that they're comparing might change from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. But when you leave this presentation today, we wanted to give you a little bit of a resource to help summarize what we've talked about and also provide you an opportunity to touch base before you go to make this decision on your own. So like Professor Jones said at the beginning of the presentation, choice of entity is a very fact-specific determination. It really does depend on what your own circumstances are, your goals of the business, and where you hope to see the business grow to in the future. So while this is not an exhaustive list, these are some of the considerations that are typically thought about when making the choice of any entity decision. We'll go through some of these with the entities that we talk about, but we just wanted to highlight a few of the more traditionally thought of ones. So taxation tends to be a large consideration. Some entities are subject to what's called double taxation, which means that the entity is taxed when they receive profits, and then the individual owners are taxed again when they receive the distribution of profits. And there's also pass-through taxation, which skips over the entity level taxation, and only owners are taxed when they receive the profits. We'll also talk about liability and the protection of assets. Some entities have limited liability, which operates as a shield from creditors who are going after the business to getting to the owner's personal assets. And so that can be a way of ensuring that the owners themselves are protected from liabilities of the company. We'll also talk about the number and types of owners, the financing options that are available, the complexity of administration, both with forming the entity and maintaining the entity. And we'll talk about the legal and administrative costs associated with that. So the first type of entity we're going to talk about is the C corporation. Andrew touched upon this, that this was traditionally the model that was used by cooperatives, but corporations are still a viable option for some cooperatives in some circumstances. C corporations are also called business corporations or for-profit corporations, and they're really what you think about when you think of large businesses. So for example, Apple and Walmart are examples of C corporations. And they're a common vehicle to owning and operating a business. In the corporation model, shareholders are the owners, they pick the board of directors who are the managers, and they then pick the officers who operate as the employees of the company. In some states, corporations can be cooperatives through statutes. Unfortunately, DC does not have a statute like this. So if you are interested in the corporations model, you would have to amend your articles of incorporation or your bylaws to get this effect. What this looks like is that in the traditional model, shareholders are allocated stock based on their capital contributions. So the more money you put into the corporation, the more rights that you have to management and profits. But in the cooperative model, the stock would be allocated based on membership. So one member equals one vote equals one stock, and it's a more equitable distribution of profits and the rights to management. So like I said before, DC does not have a statute that provides for corporations to opt into co-op status. So there aren't really a lot of examples in DC that show this model. However, in other states, this is more common. So in Virginia, co-ops are statutorily defined as corporations. So you'll see more cooperatives that are corporations. One example is the Cooperative Milk Producers Association, which was founded in 1920 and has since grown to deliver more than 5 billion glasses of milk worldwide. Another example is in New York, where corporations can opt into co-op status. So Si Se Puede is a women's cooperative that has chosen the corporations model, and they are an immigrant, women-run, women-owned, eco-friendly house cleaning business that has grown from 14 founders to over 100 members.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ryan, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about S corporations, which are also known as closely held corporations or S corps. So to preface, an S corp isn't technically a separate entity form from a C corporation that Margaret just told you about, but S corps are distinct from C corps specifically in the way that they're taxed. So an S corp is a corporation that has elected through a form filed with the IRS to be taxed as a pass-through entity for income tax purposes. So that means that whereas a C Corp is taxed on its income at the entity level and then taxed again to owners whenever profits are distributed to them, which is something that's referred to as double taxation. An S Corp income is taxed only once at the owner level. In a lot of other respects, an S Corp is pretty much the same as a C Corp, but there are some unique restrictions. And the key one is that an S Corp can only have up to 100 owners, and each owner has to be an individual, so not a corporation or a partnership, and the individual has to have US citizen or resident status. So in balancing the benefits and drawbacks, some of the key things that you'll want to consider are, on one hand, with S Corp status, you do enjoy the benefits of the corporate form without being subject to that double taxation. But on the other hand, electing to be taxed as an S Corp might make you ineligible for some provisions of the tax code that are unique to cooperatives, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. And those provisions allow a little bit more flexibility on how income is taxed as it flows through the co-op. Some jurisdictions also don't recognize the separate category of S Corps, and that includes DC. So in DC, an S Corp is treated just the same as an ordinary C Corp. And then once again, as an S Corp, you do also have to abide by those unique ownership requirements. So if you go this route, then you would want to have a pretty good idea up front of what your ownership structure is going to look like down the road. And I want to note that the benefits that you get by being an S Corp can be achieved by some other entity forms which don't have the same ownership restrictions. And that's in part because the S Corp predates some of those more modern entity forms like the LLC, which we'll talk about later on. But with that being said, whether it might be the right choice for you is going to depend on your specific facts and circumstances, which again is why we encourage you to seek the advice of a tax professional or attorney in making the decision.
Hi everyone, I'm Sean. I'm going to talk about benefit corporations. I have a disclaimer. Law students love disclaimers. The disclaimer is that benefit corporations are different from certified B Corps or certified B corporations. So I'm going to get to that in more detail, but just something to keep in mind over the next couple of slides. So benefit corporations are kind of the new kids on the block when it comes to like type of entity. Ryan and Maggie just talked a little bit about C Corps and S Corps. A benefit corporation has sort of one of the other as their underlying tax structure, but has an additional, caveat, which is that benefit corporations are set up so that there's a specific public benefit that the company is working towards. So rather than having a company in which there's a sole focus on profit or shareholder value, benefit corporations allow that specific public benefit to share the stage and kind of coexist with the business as a whole. And so right here on the slide, you'll see some examples of specific public benefit as codified in DC. And I think these are helpful in sort of seeing the similarities between the sort of underlying mission of benefit corporations and those of co-ops. I mean, serving low income and underserved individuals, economic opportunity, environmental, human health issues. I think a lot of the sort of mission of benefit corporations is kind of tied into the same sort of idea as co-ops, which is helpful. As far as requirements, benefit corporations have to identify themselves as such. So they can either have the articles of incorporation amended to reflect the status as a benefit corporation, or a new corporation could just right off the bat become one. And then there's also a requirement for a annual report. So measuring the performance of benefit corporations against a third-party standard, so that there's some indication that the specific public benefit that is being worked toward is legitimate. And sort of thinking about the advantages of benefit corporations from the co-op perspective, I did find Anchenda, which is an example of a co-op in the Mountain West region, which is also a benefit corporation. and it is in the business of sustainable agriculture. So they have an online farmers market, and their co-op members sell products that are produced through sustainable agriculture. So they chose the benefit corporation model. I'd say there's two principal things about being a benefit corporation that are worth noting. The first is that there's sort of an intrinsic benefit to putting the sort of soul of the corporation in the articles of incorporation. We care about something more than profit, and here it is, right in the articles of incorporation. That's sort of legally put down. The second is related, and that's if there's a change of ownership, or if there's a new shareholder that has a large stake of power and wants the corporation to do something that's just about profit. Well, it's harder to do that when you've sort of identified the benefit, the specific public benefit. So there's benefits to having that put down. And back to my disclaimer. So certified B corporations are not a type of entity. That's what we're talking about today. We're talking about types of entity. Benefit corporations, they are a type of entity, but B corporations, which is sort of that logo on the right side of the slide, is what you may be familiar with. They are sort of administered by a third-party nonprofit. They're something that if you're selling granola bars, you might want to put them on your granola bar to signify to consumers that we care about the environment, we care about the sort of laundry list of things that certified B Corps are required to prove that they do. Whereas a benefit corporation is actually like a legal type of entity. So I did look. Community Purchasing Alliance is a co-op in DC, which is a certified B Corp. So they're definitely out there. It's a difficult process to get through, and clearly has value in the marketplace. Patagonia being an example of an entity that is both a benefit corporation and a certified B Corp. But just keep that distinction in mind.
Hello again, everyone. It's time to talk about the Limited Cooperative Association, or LCA. So what is it? It's a cooperative, so member run, member owned, and member serving. But there are really two things of note here. Bold at the top, it says unincorporated. And so that's what sets it apart from everything you've heard about so far. You've been hearing about different types of corporations. So the LCA is not a corporation, it's unincorporated, which has certain implications that I'll talk about in a little bit. And really the biggest thing that's different is that outside investment is allowed. So just to dig a little bit deeper into what that means, traditionally, a co-op's members are also its primary customers. So members are often the primary or only source of funding for co-ops. And that source of funding might not be adequate to serve the needs of the community the way that the co-op wants to. And investors are sometimes less willing to invest in co-ops because they don't get control like proportionate to the amount of money they put in, because co-ops have a democratic ownership structure often. And so the LCA kind of helps to fill a hole in the space by incentivizing investors to provide funding when it's needed, but not allowing investors to have so much control that the social mission and purpose of the co-op is undermined. One example of a successful LCA in DC is the Girard House Co-op. I told you guys earlier that DC has a very lively housing co-op scene, and that's in part because of a law called the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, which essentially, whenever a landlord of a residential building in DC decides to sell, tenants get the first option to try and purchase the building. And that's what happened at the Girard House in Columbia Heights. The tenants decided they wanted to pool together their funds and try to buy the building that was being sold, with the goal of putting control back into their hands, being able to get the repairs and maintenance they need, and so on and so forth, and also trying to keep rent affordable. rent is skyrocketing in that area. And so you can imagine that even if the tenants put all of their available funds together, they might not be able to pool enough to be able to purchase the really expensive apartment building. And so this is an example of an instance in which it can be very useful to have somebody who's not going to be an active member of the co-op because they're not a tenant of the building, come in, an outside investor come in and provide just a little bit of extra funding to make the co-op possible and to be able to do it at all. So just to recap a few pros and cons, LCAs have the traditional benefits of cooperatives. So they're democratic and they're member focused, community oriented, and they serve social missions. Increased opportunity for funding, which is what I've been harping on this whole time. They often get better tax treatment than corporations. And they're relatively easy to establish. You just have to file the articles of organization with the DCRA. There are a few other things you have to do, maintenance wise, but you take those as they come. Cons, there can be worse investment prospects than other business entities. I mentioned earlier, they're like NGCs usually allow investors to have more control than LCAs would. And so sometimes investors are more enticed there, but the LCA really does a pretty good job of finding a good middle ground. There can be increased regulations concerning the management and structure of LCAs. I've talked about all the different goals that LCA is trying to balance, and there have to be regulations to make sure that it's functioning properly. And then some people believe that outside investment can compromise cooperative values because often, but not always, the goals of investors might differ from the community that the co-op is a part of and trying to serve. But overall, the LCA is a very useful structure for co-ops in certain instances.
Good afternoon. My name is Adam Smith, and I'll be talking about limited liability companies, or LLCs. When you're thinking about choosing the right entity for your business, LLCs often come up. And this is because the LLC shares a lot of characteristics of both corporations and partnerships. So if you're considering forming a co-op, depending on your situation, an LLC may be able to accomplish the same goal. Limited liability of an LLC offers the owners protection. However, owners will still be personally liable for any negligence or wrongful acts that they commit. The default formation of an LLC avoids double taxation, so it is a pass-through entity. And LLCs are generally thought to be well suited to businesses with a small number of members. LLCs also can have any management structure its members desire. So for these reasons, some cooperatives are actually organized as LLCs. When we talk about a member of an LLC, we're kind of restricting that definition to the owners or investors. However, when we talk about a member of a co-op, it's not just the owners or investors, it's actually the users as well. As previously mentioned, they could be referred to as member owner or member patron. The management structure for LLC comes in a wide variety of options. On one end, we have the member management structure. And this is where the members or owners actually manage the business themselves. This is the default management structure for an LLC. And because the owners have a lot of responsibility or a lot of the decision-making authority, they do have a higher responsibility to act in the best interest of the LLC. On the other end of the spectrum, with regards to management structure, we have what's called the manager management style. And this is where the owners hire someone to act as the manager and lead the business. The owners can delegate as much or as little authority as they choose to one or more managers. These managers do not need to be members of the LLC, and the managers cannot take actions outside of the ordinary course of business without member approval. And because the owners have a limited role, that's also reflected in their limited responsibility. However, that responsibility does not disappear, it just kind of shifts to the managers. And much like a corporation where the decision-making authority is vested in the directors and the officers, like the president or the vice president, that is where the responsibility will lie under this end of the spectrum for management structure. And when you think about a co-op, it's actually on that second end of the spectrum as well. LLCs in general are pretty flexible. And if you're thinking about using that legal structure for your co-op purposes, there are some considerations to think about. The first here is the purpose. An LLC purpose will vary based upon the founders and whatever they want. whereas a co-op is really community-based. It seeks the primary and mutual benefit of the patrons. With regards to management structure, as just mentioned, LLC is very flexible, but when you push it towards more of the corporate-like structure, there may be other legal implications that arise as opposed to different or other types of LLCs. With a co-op, it already resembles that corporate structure. Decision-making for LLC and co-op, they're actually pretty similar, but one thing I want to point out is that in a co-op, you actually may require the approval of each and every member before moving forward with certain decisions. Profit sharing, again, LLC can be flexible in this regard. And in a co-op, in some instances, your share of the profits may actually depend on your patronage. And that's just how many hours you put in or whatever type of contribution you're making may dictate your share of profits in that instance. And the last point I kind of want to mention is with regards to the long term. With an LLC, future owners could disagree with the direction that the business is taking and actually change or remove the provisions that make it similar to a cooperative. Whereas in a co-op, you can rely on the law to preserve those practices going forward and into the future. There are a lot of examples of LLCs in and around DC. I'll mention two here, Sinful Bites, and they strive to create a more sustainable, healthy, and just food system. They also provide cooking workshops and offer holistic eco-catering services to the community, among other things. And there's also La Coupe Coffee Co., and they're building community with every cup of coffee. They favor environmentally friendly farming techniques, quality controls, and their workers receive training and certification opportunities. These businesses want to not just add value to their communities, but also support and uplift their workers as well, and have pursued their goals via an LLC structure.
Hello, everyone. I'm Leah. I'm going to be talking about nonprofit organizations and federal tax exemptions and just give a quick recap at the end. So nonprofit organizations are categorized as organizations that don't operate for the purposes of generating profits for private individuals. And there's actually 74 different categories for tax exemptions for nonprofits. Most are familiar with the 501c3 for public charities. And these are particularly popular because any donations made are tax deductible for the donors. And so nonprofits and cooperatives have a really close relationship. They can work really closely together, and a lot of nonprofits actually serve to help support different cooperatives and their missions. So getting into cooperatives eligibility for tax exemptions, instead of going under a 501c3 like you would for a nonprofit, you're actually going to do an IRS 501c12. And this is different than for nonprofits because organizations using this tax exemption, their mission needs to be to provide certain services to its members at the lowest possible cost. And to qualify for and maintain that tax exemption, you must make sure that your cooperative receives 85% or more of its income each year from its members. And that income that's collected must be solely to meet the cooperative's losses and expenses. And these have to be maintained as long as you're seeking that federal tax exemption. And I also wanted to note that there are a little bit of differences when it comes to farming cooperatives and worker cooperatives specifically. So farming cooperatives are defined as cooperatives that purchase supplies needed for farming on behalf of member patrons, and in turn, those same member patrons farm products. So member patrons must be engaged in farming, and that can include raising livestock, poultry, maintaining nurseries, a whole bunch of different things. And farming cooperatives, in terms of taxation, they're actually exempt from federal income tax, so you don't have to worry about that. And they're either taxed at the cooperative level or the patron level, so you don't see that double taxation. Worker cooperatives are special in that they were originally formed as corporations, and they're actually referred to as subchapter T cooperatives. But worker cooperatives can do any kind of business. So a lot of examples of worker cooperatives are in housing cooperatives and insurance. And another thing to note is that any of their members, just like regular corporations, can include individuals or organizations. They are not, however, exempt from federal income tax. So their earnings are going to be taxed at the cooperative level or the member patron level, or sometimes both. So that's something to be mindful of. And I just wanted to give a few examples of different cooperatives in DC. So one worker cooperative is Circle Yoga, which was founded in 2003. And their mission is to connect underserved communities with opportunities to learn and practice yoga. And they also have different scholarship programs for individuals who want to become yoga instructors or take the classes. And a farmer cooperative operating in DC is Ward 8 Farmers Market, which was founded in 1998 after the closing of their last grocery store. And their mission is to empower residents to choose healthy foods and a healthy lifestyle by making fruits and vegetables affordable. And so one example that isn't in DC, but is a big organization that uses that 501c12 tax exemption is the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association. And they're providing electricity to rural areas in the country. And right now they've actually switched gears and they're doing a lot of disaster relief. And so they're helping residents in Alabama and Florida get their power restored after Hurricane Sally. And here's a brief summary kind of about what we talked about earlier. One of the things to mention is that this chart does include cooperatives and their relationship to all of these different things like personal liability, and that's going to be in the yellow column. And you can actually find this chart at themoneyalert.com if you want to take a closer look or need time to process and reflect. So a lot of these things that we mentioned today, you do need to file like your articles of incorporation and stuff like that. And all of that can be done at the DC Department of Consumer and Regulatory Affairs, or the DCRA. And so this is a screenshot of what their homepage will look like when you're trying to file those articles of incorporation and other information like that. And I also just wanted to point out that there are a few other places that you can go for help. There's lawhelp.org or the Pro Bono Center. Both of these websites can be a great tool if you have any other questions or just want to review some information. And lastly, we just wanted to give you some tips when you're interacting with your lawyer. It's important if your cooperative is the same or similar to an existing cooperative, even if it's in another state. I think it would be helpful if you could try and get their formation documents, which can be done through state websites similar to the DCRA. Come with a list of questions that you have, investigate funding for your cooperative, ask about anything that's unclear, and really understand all the documents that you sign. And most importantly, keep copies of everything. Keep copies of all the documents that you sign and any information, because it'll be helpful later on down the road. And we wanted to say thank you so much. And if you have any questions, you can always email us at gwusbc@law.gwu.edu, and that'll reach us at the clinic. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much for that really detailed presentation. We got quite a few questions in the chat. One of the questions is, will we be sharing the PowerPoint slides? And yes, we can send them out. I know that there were some links there for some of the co-ops. There also was a chart that was kind of hard to read, but we'll send you the slides so that you can see it. We'll also be sending out a copy of the webinar recording and the contact information for both the Law Clinic and for Wacif. Some of the other questions in the chat, I'll read them and then I'll invite the panelists to reply. One of the questions is, can you have a nonprofit with a cooperative program as a part of it? Does it have to be an S Corp or a C Corp? And I can answer the first part of that question, and then I'll invite our panelists to answer the second part. So there are nonprofits that have kind of a hybrid co-op model where they'll have a nonprofit and then they'll have a co-op arm. The co-op will have a nonprofit arm. And one example of that is Child Space, which is a child care cooperative in Philadelphia. And so they have the child care cooperative, and they also have a nonprofit arm that allows them to receive grants so that they can provide child care services to low-income mothers and low-income families. So that's an example of kind of a hybrid cooperative model where the co-op has a nonprofit arm. And then the second part of a question is, if you have a nonprofit with a cooperative program as a part of it, does it have to be an S Corp or a C Corp? Can any of the panelists answer that question?
Yeah, I can answer that. So it doesn't. A lot of cooperatives are actually structured as nonprofits, and that's a really useful tool because you can get more grants and stuff like that, but you can just form your nonprofit to operate as a cooperative through your articles of incorporation and other documents like that. And that's how you can structure it as a nonprofit cooperative.
And then lastly on that point, as I mentioned at the beginning, we have a grant program, the DC Co-op Impact Grant, and that is a grant program. You don't have to repay the funds, but you also don't have to be a nonprofit to access it. So it's a grant that we give to cooperative businesses. And Capital Impact Partners, which is the organization that Wacif partnered with to do the DC Co-op Impact Grant, they also have a larger grant program called the National Co-op Impact Grant. And they also award grants that you don't have to repay to cooperative businesses. So those are two grant programs that you may want to check out if you're forming a cooperative. The next question
I'm sorry,
is—
before you move on, Jennifer, I just wanted to sort of add that this is a very interesting and complex area. And we often refer to them as sort of tandem organizations, like a nonprofit working in collaboration with a for-profit. And that's exactly what a lawyer will help you tease out in great detail once there's a sense of what the idea is and what the goals are. So I just wanted to clarify that. It's important to understand that a cooperative by its intent is designed to be a for-profit, even though it has charitable characteristics.
Thank you for that clarification. And Professor Jones, just a question for you. The George Washington Clinic works with cooperative businesses. How can a cooperative access legal services at George Washington?
Great, that's a great question. So if you go onto our website, you will see an application for pro bono legal assistance. And so someone can fill out that application and we can review it. What I would recommend if somebody has an interest to email me or email the website that's shown. We have a limited number of spaces available for select clients, and we're looking for clients, of course, that provide a good educational experience for the students, and also looking for clients that will have high impact in community, right? So the further along that a cooperative is in its organizational process, the greater likelihood that we can provide the best legal assistance to it. And thank you for that question. We're always interested in receiving applications and assessing whether or not it's something that we can take on.
Great, thank you. And we will share the contact information for the clinic in the follow-up email after the webinar. Another great question is, which of the types of entities that you mentioned allow for its members not to be US citizens or permanent residents? And so for undocumented people, which type of cooperative entity form allows them to be members of the cooperative?
So that's a very fact-specific question. What I will say is this: there are a number of law review articles that have been written about the use of cooperatives in the undocumented space. And so what I would say is it's something that a number of scholars and a number of legal clinics like ours have given some thought to. And indeed, there is, and you can Google this, and I can provide additional information, there is a guide to immigrant worker cooperatives that is available publicly on the internet. So this is something that people have given great consideration to. And again, so much of it's going to be based on a set of facts in the jurisdiction in which the entity is set up.
Thank you. And just to build on that, the Beloved Community Incubator is an organization that's based out of DC. It's based at Luther Place Church in Logan Circle. And they help form cooperatives with undocumented people. So they're another great resource to check out. And they successfully launched a cooperative last year that included undocumented women. And so I will share that resource also in the follow-up. Another question in the Q&A box, and please feel free if you have questions to ask them in the Q&A. Can you put the link for the business structure chart that she just showed in the chat? Leah, if you have that link, if you can drop it and I can share it with attendees, we will also send it out afterwards. And then another question is, how can one distinguish an LLC as a co-op?
So I can respond to that. So the LLC provides a lot of flexibility in terms of how it can be organized. So as was described in the presentation, an LLC is a cross between a partnership and a corporation. So there's a lot of latitude in terms of how the documents can be structured, particularly in the operating agreement. So it's really in the drafting of the operating agreement that distinction is made to determine how the co-op will be organized. And there are a number of examples in DC of cooperatives that are organized as LLCs.
Thank you. Another question is, can this be used for succession of a professional services firm as well, switching over from member manager to manager management? So the cooperative model can be used to convert an existing business into a cooperative, and those are called cooperative conversions. And Wacif is a member of the Workers to Owners Collaborative. I see Joe Marifino, who runs that collaborative, on this call. It's a collaborative led by the Democracy at Work Institute. And it's a group of organizations that help existing businesses convert their business to employee ownership. And so that is possible. It's a model that is gaining steam around the country. And if you would like to explore that further, please reach out to me afterwards and we can help walk you through that process. But yes, you can convert an existing business into an employee-owned business. Another question is, how much are the grants provided by Capital Impact and Wacif? So for the first round of the DC Co-op Impact Grant that we did earlier this year, the grants were $5,000 each. I believe for the National Co-op Impact Grant that Capital Impact Partners does, the amounts vary, but I believe it's around $50,000. When we do the second round of the grant, which will be in the early part of 2021, we're hoping that we'll be able to increase the grant amount for the DC Co-op Impact Grant to more than $5,000 each. But as it stands, our DC Co-op Impact Grant Program awards $5,000, and the Capital Impact Co-op grant is, I believe, $50,000. And you can learn more about that on the Capital Impact Partners website. Okay, another great question. What happens when workers or housing co-op members leave? Do they retain ownership rights or do they sell their ownership rights?
So typically, it depends on how the organization is organized, but the answer to that question would probably be found in the bylaws or in the operating agreement for the entity. So the process for for leaving the entity and for non-participation would be laid out in that process. So again, it would just depend on the organizing documents and what was envisioned in the beginning.
Thank you. So another question is, can you talk a little bit about limited equity cooperatives and whether the statute applies only to housing cooperatives? And I believe this question is related to the limited cooperative association entity type.
I am not sure about this question. Professor, do you have any thoughts?
Sorry, I am not sure of the answer to that question. I would need to look at the statute specifically. And so I would like to take that under advisement. That's, again, a very specific question that I would need to look at the statute for.
Thank you. Okay, another question is, so if you want to establish a worker-owned cooperative, are the majority of co-ops a profit-based model or a nonprofit-based model? And I can kick off that answer, and if anybody from the GW Clinic would like to add, please feel free. Most cooperatives are, most worker cooperatives are for-profit business entities. And GWU, if you have anything to add to that, please feel free.
Yeah, I would say that legally that's an important distinction, right? That although cooperatives have characteristics that include charitable and educational functions that you might find in a C3, the distinction is that they are indeed deemed to be for-profit entities, and they're treated very differently in the law. So yes, that's an important point.
Thank you. The next question is, the number of worker co-ops is less than 400 in the United States. Why is that?
I could take a stab at this one. I think it's hard to say exactly why. I've read a couple of articles recently saying that that number is going up. But I think it has to do with social and political factors. One of the reasons that was pointed to in an article I read recently was that there isn't legislation in a lot of states specific to worker cooperatives. So worker cooperatives are having to kind of figure out what their requirements are based off statutes that are supposed to be for consumer cooperatives or different types of cooperatives, which just creates confusion and makes the process harder and makes it less likely that worker cooperatives will form.
And I'd also like to just add that it may be because worker cooperatives are taxed differently. So those are those subchapter T treatments that I was talking about. And so they're treated very similarly to corporations. So you have the potential to have the worker cooperative be taxed and all of its members be taxed as well. So that's not as an attractive option. So maybe that's contributing to the, the small number.
Yes, and as Andrew said, that number is on the rise and has been on the rise. And one of the national organizations for cooperatives is the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops. It's a really great resource, and you can see some of the co-ops that have emerged around the country. Cooperatives are organizing together around policy to create an environment that is more conducive to the creation of new co-ops. I will say at the local level, we're also organizing around policy to make it easier for people to start and grow and fund co-ops. One great group locally here in DC is the DC Cooperative Stakeholders Group. We meet monthly and we talk about things like co-op policy. It's a place for people that are trying to start co-ops to come and learn from people who are in existing co-ops. And if you look up DC Cooperative Stakeholders Group on Eventbrite, you can see that there's a meeting coming up next week. It's free, it's open to everyone to join. And so that's a great resource for people locally here in DC. And I think the website is dcstakeholders.coop. We have 3 more minutes. And so we're gonna try to answer all of the questions in the chat. But if we don't get to them, I encourage you to reach out to the panelists and we will provide their contact information afterwards. One question is there a rule of thumb for what should go in the bylaws versus the operating agreement? And what are the difference between those two documents?
That's a big question. So because operating agreements, and because LLCs are really a cross between a corporation and a partnership agreement, those documents can look very different. They can look more like corporate bylaws, or they can look more like partnership agreements, or they can look like a combination of both, right? So the question was, is there a rule of thumb? And the answer is no, there really isn't a rule of thumb. We certainly have different samples and template documents and different provisions that we think about when we're drafting, but each set of documents is based on the particular facts of the case and what the organizers are trying to accomplish. So they can look very different depending on what the goal and mission is. Let me give you an example. An example might be, a specific provision in either instance for consensus decision-making, right? That everybody has to come to agreement on a particular point. So these are sort of the finer points of lawyering in this space, is understanding what the client's goals are and then drafting to be able to meet those goals.
Thank you so much. We are out of time. I want to thank all of you for attending. We will send out the webinar, the slide deck, and some of the resources that we mentioned in a follow-up email. The email will go out within a few days. We have to pull the webinar recording and do some light edits to it, but you will receive it in a few days. Again, many thanks to the George Washington Clinic for preparing this wonderful deck and presenting to us today. One last resource that I wanted to share, October is National Co-op Month, and there is a conference held by the National Cooperative Business Association that's coming up October 5th through 9th, and that is called the Co-op Impact Conference. And so I will be on a panel with Capital Impact Partners, and one of the recipients of our DC Co-op Impact Grant, a Black-led cooperative out of Maryland called Earthbound Building. And that panel discussion is going to be called Building an Equitable and Inclusive Local Co-op Ecosystem in DC. We will share the link for that conference, but it's the NCBA CLUSA 2020 Co-op Impact Conference. It should be great. They'll talk about all types of cooperative types. And lastly, another great resource if you're in the process of creating your bylaws or your operating agreement is the Southern Economies Law Center. They have a lot of great resources on their website about bylaws creation. So I encourage you to check out that resource. Thank you so much for coming to this workshop. It's the first in a 4-part series about cooperative businesses. And so we'll also be doing a workshop on cooperative governance. We'll be doing a session on how to set up profit sharing structures in your cooperative. And we'll be doing a session on how to finance a cooperative. And that one will be led by the Shared Capital Cooperative. And so all of the sessions will have different speakers, different topics. We'll send out the Eventbrite links for those, and we encourage you to come back. And thank you so much for attending. Have a great day.